Well, here we are again. I love saying that. We are lighting the candle, a world that works. I'm Bill Carell, and I'm here with two of my closest buddies as far as the internet is concerned, and in the real world as well. Mr. Ken Caputo and also Miss Jan Jeremias. And I've been kind of in an interesting space over the last 3 or 4 days, both with having my birthday yesterday. There are as many as 5 or 6 different relatives that all have birthdays within a week of mine. So it's been a very interesting time. And then of course we're getting ready to start a vacation on Saturday out until about the 5th of April. And in the meantime, more or less just kind of hearing from some people different things that are going on, and saw a very interesting piece having to do with reality and the conversation around reality. So I thought that that might not be, emotionally charged, and it might be a good safe spot for us to really put our beings together and talk about what reality actually is, and what's the access to real reality. Okay, how's that sound?
Sounds good to me.
Interesting.
All right. So I'll toss this out there. Saw a YouTube video, and the premise was there is no reality. At least there's no reality that you and I can experience. And the main reason for that is that we don't live in an unadulterated sensory world where we are experiencing exactly what's going on around us at all times. The thought was is that we live into a narrative, and in most cases, it's not a narrative that we understand or are aware of. And that kind of holds us prisoner in terms of how we react to things and our ability to be objective. And, I'm adding a little bit more of the qualifiers to it. But the basic premise is that all human beings have earned and deserve the narrative that they're operating under, and they don't know it. So that being the case, you and I, Ken, we've talked at length about confirmation bias and all the other sort of things that are there. And we've never really said this out loud before, but confirmation bias is not something of the person who's under its grip is aware of. They just think this is how it is, you know? So the really cool part of it is that if you take an opportunity uh, to look into um, just what we experience in life, whether there's suffering or joy or anything of that nature. The good news is that if you realize that whatever you're experiencing isn't probably what's really going on, I think you have some opportunities to use that curious mind approach and come back to it with some sort of a question. Let's just say that what I'm reacting to and what I'm seeing isn't necessarily what's actually going on. So, Jen, while you were away, what I was saying is that if we could explore the notion of the that we really don't experience the world that it is as it is, and what if, not saying this is true or anything, but one interpretation of how to gain power in your life is whenever you're feeling disempowered, is to basically step back for a moment, use the curious mind, and ask a question about it. What is it about what's going on right now that I'm feeling, engaged with or trapped by or disempowered by or happy by or joyous about, any of those things where it's just an automatic reaction to what's going on. There's an opportunity to learn more, not only about the world, but about yourself, simply because if we walk around and what we are confronted with is a mirror of what we already know and believe in our mind and have forgotten that that's what it is, the opportunity to discover has to come from asking questions. I'm saying I offer that for your approval.
All I can think of is the scene in The Matrix. You remember that movie, the original one?
Don't
Where
try to
there's
bend the spoon.
yeah, and there's basically one of the characters who pretty much said, plug me back in. Because if I
Yeah.
don't know, that if this is what reality feels like to me, then what's the difference? And what struck me about that is, I guess that's, I think one of the assumptions we can erroneously make is that people want to question their own reality. I mean, if they're comfortable with the ways things are, then they'll resist any attempts to open them to other possibilities, because that's not what they want. So when we're from the outside, it's, I mean, think of it this way: someone who has a difficult, if they look at someone running and they're like, why would anyone ever do that? What is wrong with that person that they're doing that? I would never do that. That person is crazy, that kind of thing. You really just have an essential disconnect where one person is, they have like a judgment reaction based on how firm they are in their belief system. And the runner could be doing the same thing. If you only knew, if you only knew how wonderful running is, if you only tried it once, then your world would be so much better because it would be more like mine, you know, and that also is equally probably not true. So, so I guess that's the first question.
Well, I'll tell you what.
Yeah.
I got an immediate response to that. Those conversations mentally never go on. Okay, that's a person thinking about another person thinking, and I think Confucius said it best. If you want to know what somebody else is thinking, don't bother because they're not. you know so I love how you said that, but that brings in a value of somebody being awake enough to ask a question about somebody else's behavior and caring about it enough to have that conversation go on more than just a flash. So I think what you're demonstrating is that there is already an unknown, unseen, invisible bias to person's reaction that might be more visceral, or you might feel it in the body more than having a word conversation go on in your head, possibly.
Yeah, and I guess it just struck me like it feels like, for me anyway, are the people we're speaking to today people who are comfortable with the idea of their own perception of reality being challenged? Or, is that who we're talking to today? Because there's a lot of people who they are not interested in having that conversation, and it could be for a lot of reasons. I'm not judging it. I'm just saying that, it's like, I guess it's like I'm thinking about the specificity of the audience, because without that, I feel like you could end up having a conversation that's not going to align with where people are, you know, in
Well,
their
here's the
present state.
interesting part of that. When have we ever been concerned about who our listeners are?
True,
So
true.
I'm what I'm saying to you is this is every conversation we have is useless. You cannot use the conversation like a tool or grab an end of it and then understand it immediately and put it to work. This isn't what our conversations are about. And what I think you're going to find is just as this kind of triggered you a little bit about, people being evaluative, that's one way that it's going to show up, which I think is very, very powerful to notice when it's going on. Neither to judge nor to try to understand, but to do it this way. If you're thinking about a judgment of someone else's behavior, you're missing what's going on in your world and being present to it right now. That's what's
Mhm.
possible here in what I think, is available in the conversation. If there's any gold, people are going to discover it for themselves. I wouldn't give them the answer if I knew it. You know what I mean? So, in terms of the listening audience, there may be a person who gets different parts of what we talk about and may hear more from you, Ken, than they do from me, or more from you, Jan, than they do from either of us. And I think that the whole perspective of what you're bringing is that there's an already always listening. Like there's already a way to process any new piece of information that comes in that is pretty much, synaptically wired. So it's going to go down the same roads and streets to get to a certain place, unless there's a listener that's listening to that inside your head going, that's an interesting response on my part. Now there's something to talk about. And you jumped ahead to that without going through the steps of noticing that there's an evaluation going on and what's up with that. Or why did the jogging catch my attention in the first place? I don't give a good rap about that. But it's not ever, in my world, if you're judging somebody else's behavior, what are you really coming back to? A discord with what you said before and the confirmation bias, which you can't see. It's just a filter, in our model that I'm posing over here today, which isn't the truth. It's just another narrative.
Well, I think what you're talking about is your personal reactions to whatever is in your surroundings, whatever that is, and starting to be curious about those reactions and why you have them or why you stay with them. Like if you're stuck in a situation, why you spend a prolonged period of time being in that space. Maybe because that reaction is comfortable and it's something that you're familiar with and but it's being curious about something that makes you feel uncomfortable and why that is. And just looking at it and saying, isn't that interesting? It's like, oh, I had that reaction to something like, or I felt insecure about that. What is that about?
What does that make possible?
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, if you get there and you want to have a different response, then is what does that make possible for me? Or if I decide to stay, also, what is that telling me? Then it's almost it can go in almost any direction. Like the possibilities
Mm.
are then endless because you can sit there and say, okay, well, I'm willing to stay in this, really rotten or mucky space. What does that say right now? Like maybe I'm not ready, maybe I'm afraid. I mean, it always tells us something.
I think you're pointing to a really, really strong characteristic of human nature, in my experience, whether I'm right or wrong, that people would much rather, and again, back to what you were saying before, be completely unhappy in their confirmation bias, as opposed to being in that state of I don't know, and that's really far more comfortable than knowing that you're a bigot.
Well, the
I,
interesting thing is like I think it clarifies something. It's less about judgment and more about, to me, I was thinking in terms of identity. So like if you're a core part of your identity is I am one who does not run.
yep.
So you're going to frame the things contextually that come in and out of your quote unquote reality around your identity. So you're going to be attracted to people who also do not run. You may be of the type of person who has to take it a step further and advocate against running to take that confirmation of your own identity set point even deeper. And I think that's a lot of what we see right now, where you've got a lot of attempts to kind of really really harden you know how people see themselves, that
Right.
identity, and actually distorting their perception of reality so that they can stay in that bubble. So, and it's an interesting thing because I mean the first thing you have to do is you have to agree to the fact that every single one of us has ignorance, you know period, you know full stop. We are ignorant and everyone around us is ignorant. It's all the degrees and how that expresses itself, but none of us are omniscient, therefore we don't have all of the facts or information. So
Yeah, the whole notion of, and I use the word bigot for a very good reason, because it doesn't mean what people think it means. Okay. It has been adapted over the last 50 years to take the place of the word prejudice and bias. However, being a bigot is somebody who is obstinately or unreasonably attached to a belief, opinion, or a faction. So That could be anything. It's more or less that when you, as you said, Ken, you're completely asleep to what your reaction is, and if you don't like your reaction, the really bad news is it's going to be up to you to change it. That's not an external thing that other people will get to vote on whether or not your life gets better.
Oh, you can do all you want and try to make all like as Ken says, like you can navigate and customize your world so that kind of like a Facebook feed, which feeds you information like that which you like, and then it keeps on giving you the same information because that's what it knows that you've responded to. So it's kind of like that in your life. Surround yourself with people who hate running and you, whatever you need to do to mold your environment to meet that sort of form of your identity, or if you want to even call it a label
You
of
Well,
want
whatever.
to
that
know the really scary part of that is depending on how deep that need to defend your identity goes, you end up taking that step of we must eradicate all runners.
That's right.
This is a threat to my way of life.
Hmm.
Running is so bad, it's so dangerous, it's so hazardous. It needs to be removed for the sake for the betterment of all.
yeah.
And
Right.
my reality is so powerful and entrenched, and my belief is so deep that they're asleep to the dangers and risks of running. So if they only were awake,
That's
so
right.
like even that term now has become perverted in a lot of ways because it's really not being seen through a clear lens anymore. It's being seen through a lens of polarization. So it's very interesting when you start getting in the weeds with it.
So what you're saying is so powerful. An example of what you're talking about, Jan, is what Facebook does every single day to all of us. I have
Yeah.
5,000 friends. Okay. There's no way that I could see all their feeds. So the algorithm takes care of that little bit for me, and I get to see the same 50, 60 people, all the time. But what that basically means is the other 4,000 and whatever, I never interact with them at all. There's no relationship to us other than the facts that if I look at their list and they look at mine, we're on each other's lists. I have to go seek somebody out. And it's like that aha moment that I haven't talked to somebody that I used to talk to all the time because the algorithm or my blindness of my current belief system that I'm unaware of because I don't know which people are not getting my feed or I'm whose feed I used to get that I'm not getting. I love that. It's a really, really, really great similar simile or an analogy. Our living is a lot like Facebook. There's some sort of a hidden algorithm that's working here that we have no idea, and
And,
being able to notice that is really powerful.
right. And or just when you begin to notice it, just I guess, is seeing it for what it is and knowing that about whatever. It's like knowing stuff about yourself, the stuff that's everything, that's who you are. So it's the good, bad, and everything if you want to label it, but I don't really like to label it as good or bad. It just is.
There's another piece to it too, Ken, and which is the ultimate form of mass gaslighting, where you don't even tell people anything. You just keep showing them the same things over and over and over as if they are the truth.
Yep.
Then they become the truth.
That's what cult leaders do.
And media. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah.
And great leaders who are not out for what's good for people.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing, so now that you got the flip side, so the algorithms of life that allow us to sort out, things that don't align or people that don't align with who we are is what allows us to find a community and feel more connected and probably more productive in a lot of ways. So isn't it interesting that it can work both for you and against you? Like in a business setting, you need a team of people that aren't talented. You need a team of people that are aligned.
Yes.
And if there's a book called The No Asshole Rule. It was a business book about addition by subtraction, and the fact that one person can just wreck an entire organization if they're not aligned, if they're creating resistance. And they may not be a bad person and they may flourish in another environment, but they don't flourish in that one. So what you really need is an algorithm that selects in the right people and selects out the people that they're not wrong, they're just wrong for that. So, because I know that, I look at Facebook and there are many people that I'm friends with on Facebook. I don't want to see what they're posting. It's unhealthy for me.
Mhm.
I have no interest in engaging in that kind of, and I do everything I can, the little that I'm on there now, to hide those, like to, so that I don't see that. It's like, be the equivalent of eating really, really crappy food every day. It's just not good for me.
So
I'm there with you, Ken, because I do the same thing. There are certain people I just can't. I can't. I mean,
Yeah.
I've been friends with people and unfollowed them because I don't want to see the stuff they post.
Yeah.
Um, uh, I was just because it doesn't serve any sort of productive benefit for me at all. I can't find any sort of redeeming factors. So I'm just like, okay.
Mm.
So that brings full circle back to Cypher, okay, who was the character in the Matrix that you were talking about, Ken.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay. I
So
didn't know
he,
his name.
yeah, Cypher, played by Joey Pants. My favorite part about all of that is exactly what you're talking about. He had the awareness of having had exited the Matrix and got to live life in all of its austerity, in that outside the Matrix type of a situation. And he goes back in and he's meeting with an agent, and he says, "I know that this steak is not real, but yet it's juicy and it's flavorful." And he says, "Yes, I'll choose this." And it's a little bit
Mm.
like you having the opportunity to see something coming across your feed in Facebook where you now know you don't necessarily want to be seeing that anymore, or there's another steak that you'd rather have. But the choices that we make, where we close our mind to the possibility and stop listening to certain pieces of input, are right in line with whatever internal mechanisms that have been set up that we either may or may not be aware of. Some of them serve us, some of them don't. Some of them, keep life in a narrow kind of an operating area. But what's missing is all the other potential possibilities, and that's a choice that you get to make, right? Because you're awake, you were outside, now you're back inside, and you go, nope, don't need to see that feed anymore. How many folks at home just think that feed is bad and wrong and rail against it and lose power in their life, being upset? You know what I mean? So that wake up consciousness is, oh, by the way, I can shut this off.
Mm. I tell you, that's an interesting thing too, because there's that. It's a difficult skill to develop, to be able to clearly look around you and look within you and say, is this healthy for me? And when you've got so much noise, whether it's through marketing or relationships that are convincing you something may or may not be, whichever direction it's in, when that may not actually be true to you, you know? And it's so interesting how so many of these things can be hard to measure. Like I'm still blown away by what I believed was quality sleep relative to when I had actual physical data from a tractor tracker telling me whether or not it was quality sleep based on data it was collecting from my own physiology. So I had this belief of what how much sleep I needed and what quality sleep was, and it wasn't really true. It wasn't really factual. And as tuned in as I am, I couldn't really tell the difference. To a degree, you can, but the subtleties of it are really interesting. So we're all asking ourselves to figure out, is that really bad for me? Is that those people that if I'm seeing them on Facebook, and we may have varying degrees of sensitivity to it, but like I started watching the news again because I wanted to be plugged in, number one, to what's going on in the world, because there's too much going on in the world right now not I don't feel ignorance is a good choice. I feel being informed is important, but also learning to listen in a way where I could better understand, you know, I don't know, the power at play, in that thing. So, but then how do you do that without letting it start to influence you where you become an angry, crazy person? Because, so it's like, what's the right amount that you can digest, and how do you stay tuned into that process?
Well, here's the interesting further perspective of what you're talking about, where we have been kind of guided into a position of having to make choices. For example, I'm sure you don't listen and talk, listen to every kind of news feed that's available out there. Each of us gets to a point where there's stuff that upsets us far less than anything else we listen to. And in many cases, it may not even be something that we totally or completely agree with. And we'll, being enlightened human beings will go, well, that's kind of cool that I don't agree with everything that they're saying. But the main thing is you can only listen to one source at a time for comprehensions. You can listen to a lot of other stuff, but it turns into noise. And that's exactly what happens, in social media with the advertising and all the rest of that sort of thing. Sooner or later, there's a source that you feel like you can trust it. And whether or not it's true really kind of matters less than whether or not it kind of subtly and kind of invisibly rings and resonates with what you believe. And that's really true, I think, for most people. And that's how there are all those people who say CNN is the only place to get your news. The New York Times is the only newspaper to read, and no one should ever listen to Fox, right? Except for who's got the highest ratings on TV. So the bottom line to all of it is that it's all this narration that's going on up to and including how you should feel about what's going on in the world based on who's telling you how you should feel about what's going on in the world.
Yeah, it's I think the interesting thing is what I've done is I listen. I listen, there's some information, and then there's the interpretation of that information. So, and what's interesting to me is how, understanding how they're interpreting it based on the master that they're serving. So, and that's what you really want to look at, and that master may be an audience. Like, to me, the ratings is a trap, because I mean, we're seeing that play out right now. An audience said to a media company, this is what we want, and if you don't give it to us, we'll go elsewhere. So they made some decisions that kept their audience but weren't necessarily the best things to do from a journalistic standpoint, that kind of thing. So, so it's always interesting how you got to kind of separate that out a little bit and then play the long game of what is the world I want to live in? What kind of world do I want to live in? And then, you know, interpret that information and the people who are saying it based around that. But I find myself more and more interested in listening to things I don't agree with, and especially the ones that are being very hyperbolic and, you know, because it's it's interesting looking at that through the lens of the influence that it creates by triggering the part of our nervous system that, you know, goes into crisis mode, which creates a whole series of more controllable responses. Like if you go in the ring and you can rattle the other person, get them angry and really frustrated, and wanting to win, you just won. They're so much easier because now they're not in control of themselves anymore. You're in control of them.
They're not
So
present.
yeah, yeah.
They're,
So,
they're,
but if
they're
they're like,
using-
if they're like giving
if
you a
you
little
think about
smile and they're like nodding and saying, "I know what you're doing," I'm like, "Oh man, the chess match is on." This is a very different, circumstance than someone who's been, quote unquote, triggered into a series of, reactions.
Well, I got something else for you. Okay, this really struck me as cool, and it was attributed to Sam Clemens, but I don't know for sure if it is or not. He said if you take 100 black ants and put them in a jar, and then you take 100 red ants and you put them in the jar, uh, they'll be fine. But if you pick the jar up and you shake it, they'll fight with each other till the last ant is alive. Red
Mhm.
ants killing black ants killing red ants. And at the end of the day, when there's conflict, between you and me, and whatever group somebody said that we're in, that the other person's not in, the question isn't what's wrong with the other person. The question is who's shaking the jar.
Mhm.
And so that's where these narratives and being open to the possibility of, in a moment, could you give up, that everything you believe isn't true? I mean, is it possible for a person to be that open-minded to basically say, I can do a little bit more investigation here and actually see if there's a string here that is really abhorrent to me. It doesn't line up with anything that I know to be true. And the neat part of it is if it's something that you're absolutely certain is completely true, it's probably not. It's probably a place where you've stopped being interested in asking questions about it or gaining any other information, or maybe you gave up on trying to find a source that wasn't being driven by clickbait or advertising or just plain lying to you to get you to do something.
I think well, one forgot about the one I always think, and that's just basic greed is the one that I always think about. Like, coming from a much more scientific background, um, I always look to who's funding and who's paying for the studies and what vested interest do they have in the data that is generated, and are they trying to get me, basically, are they trying to get the person to buy something or to buy into something so that
Yeah.
they perpetuate. And so I always just look to the basic, fundamentals of, sadly enough, a lot of what people are looking for, and that's money.
Yeah. I love what you said there because I took a marketing class in college. And so we got, into a particular part of it. We're talking about, how marketing programs succeed. And so, the instructor asked a question. He said, well, what motivates people? And then somebody would say, well, being happy. Yeah. Okay. That's pretty good. Being happy, wrote that on the board. Then somebody else wrote being successful. Yeah. Well, that's pretty good. Yeah. That's good too. How about not being angry? Yeah, yeah, not being angry. And so we got about 30 things up on the board. And he said, y'all missed everything. There are only three things that motivate people. He said, fear, greed, and envy. And that's what a good marketer knows. And those are the three things that they will keep trotting out in front of you. They'll either make you afraid, they'll make you want their product because, well, all your friends have it. And then number three, they'll make it unavailable to you so that you have to have it. You have no choice than to go and figure out a way to get that thing that they've made almost impossible for you to get in their advertising, in their marketing. So that was kind of neat. Of course, we were only, like 20 years old at the time, but the point is that most people don't realize the tools that are being used every single day, in every place that they go to make them unhappy with what's in front of them that they can notice. And the fight to get their attention with all of this other stuff that, we're really not interested in, but somehow we get interested in it, and that's kind of weird.
Just had a thought about sort of the just like a very insidious little trap in following this, because it's like, okay, yes, someone's shaking the jar or something, whether intentional or not. But it seems like a good question to ask is, who am I when the jar is shaking?
Hmm.
You know, because right now we get real caught up. It's like, did the did COVID start in a lab or was it an animal? To me, what's more important is how do we manage our response to something like this happening again, which it will, more effectively. And yes, we do need to. how much of our resources should be going into the blame game, or who's shaking the jar. And and part of it does need to do that so that we can get an upstream you know perspective of how to keep it from happening. But if each individual is less rattled when the jar is shook, then all of a sudden the motivation to shake the jar comes down a lot. So if people consumed media, and their news sources, and what they expected was fair and ethical journalism, and they starved out anything that wasn't that, that would change the game. If we told politicians we're literally not going to vote for you when you behave that way, they'd stop behaving that way. So it's like that. You come back to that personal responsibility. Who are we? So instead of I'm who I am because someone shook the jar and I couldn't, how could I be anything else? It's their fault for shaking the jar and putting me in this position, you know?
I love what you're saying, and I think you're on a track that I can identify with. And I want to pose to you that you're making a decision that that you recognize that the jar's being shook is probably not all that powerful unless you can get the other 199 ants to agree with you. Everyone needs to stop fighting. You can't
The,
just be the passive ant that's the next one to get killed. Okay.
the data would say you need to get 18 ants. You need to get 18%.
I mean, good
So,
luck with that when you have 200 people fighting with each other.
But
but
Maybe
if you have that mindset though, then you're not even, you're dismissing the possibility that there could be a better way, that there could be evolution, even in less than 20% of any given population. So instead, and
let me
it's
give you
it's
an
kind of
example.
interesting. Like I learned this in first aid. Like if you were in a crowd and someone was hurt, like when I was a lifeguard, you had to
Yeah.
point to someone and say, "You call 911 right now." Because if you just said someone get help, no one would respond. But if you got one person to take action, everybody else would start to rally around how they could take action. But you needed the one, you know? So someone's got to be the one, and maybe you will be the only one, and maybe you'll be the only ant not fighting and you get eaten alive. Well, maybe someone survives from that 200 and they remember that. And over time, they have the opportunity, I mean, who knows, but someone's got to start the ripple effect somewhere.
Well, in times of peace, I completely agree with you. But in the middle of Portland 2 years ago, when people are rioting and burning things down, there's no one person that can stop that by saying who's shaking the bot the jar here. So on the
I
one hand,
disagree with that. Yeah, I I rarely disagree completely, but I completely disagree
people
with
left.
that.
They went home. People got up and left. They went home. All the shop owners left. So the point I'm trying to make to you is that theoretically yes, but in the heat of battle, when people have lost their mind, yeah, somebody has to do something really really loud to get the attention of all the people on both sides to get them to stop. So I agree with you. That's going to be a person.
Well, and I think that, there's you can't fix these things in like a place and time. So there's shops being burned down or whatever. There's a riot going on, and yes, in that moment someone standing there may not make a difference, but the next morning that shopkeeper just quietly sweeping the street in front of his shop and opening up with his broken windows with cardboard across it, not fighting back, not yelling, not standing out front with, ready to defend his property, but just cleaning up and going back to service. That that could be the thing, so
Let me let
it's
me
not
just
only what
let me
happens in the
elaborate
moment,
on the
it's how you
facts, okay?
respond to it you know
I don't mean to talk over you, but let me elaborate with the facts. City Hall was vacated. Police precinct stations were vacated. They were burned. Okay. So, what
Mhm.
I'm offering to you is sometimes it's not a day, sometimes it's a whole season, sometimes it's 10
Mhm.
years. Look at what's been
Sure.
going on in Venezuela, for the last 8 years.
Mhm.
Where is there a passive or a peaceful way to make a change to the jar being shook? This is an interesting thing because I think you're onto something. Mahatma Gandhi would agree with you 1000%.
So, and I'm saying, so are those buildings still vacated? Are they still burnt? Have they
Many of
been
them are.
restored? Have they been repaired? Is there some semblance, even if it wasn't what it was? Are there people who are modeling? They're serving as examples of peace after the crisis. Because to me, yes, that was human oriented, but an earthquake can wipe out a town or a
Right.
city. I mean, anything can do. And then what do you do afterwards? You have some people that loot, and then you have other people who rally to get food to people and rescue missions. It's the jar gets shook, and then who are we? And maybe instead of just while the jar is shaking, you got to put your head down. But who are you after? I mean, I always think about, if I had to defend myself physically and I hurt another human, the first thing I would do, I mean, if it worked out that way, I might be the one that gets hurt. Doesn't, I have some advantages, but whatever. The first thing I would do on the other side is get them to the medical attention they needed. Period. It's just that's who I'm going to be, and it doesn't mean I'm not going to protect myself, but afterwards I'm going to remind myself I'm a compassionate human being, and whether this person deserves it or not, I'm not going to abandon who I am because someone else shook the jar, you know? So
And,
so
you
I
know,
guess that's what I'm saying.
that's what a leader would say. Okay. And I appreciate that. Do you realize that out of all the people that were involved with it, those that had their property destroyed and had things stolen from them, they'll never get over that. They don't have the capacity inside themselves to forgive and forget, or the next day, go back to life as usual. Their life's been destroyed. And for the rest of their lives, they're going to have confirmation bias like you will not believe. And those are the people that this conversation is most likely to help.
Mhm.
You don't
Well,
have
because
to
they
after
have
the
the
trauma is
capacity
over.
though. They have the
Exactly.
capacity. They just, it's just that no one's modeled a different way. Sometimes it's generationally. I worked with kids in a middle school and they were taught by their parents and their grandparents, you don't stay hit. If someone hits you, you hit them back.
Right.
And all I didn't tell them that was wrong. I taught them how to block. That's it. Just taught them how to block. And
Or
it
done.
broke. I've, several stories of that breaking that generational pattern because someone just took the time to model a different behavior. And some of them kept hitting because that's who they were, just like you're saying. But some didn't, you know? And that's all each of us can control is who we choose to be and what we model when the jar is shook, so and I guess that's my focus. And yes, absolutely, there are swaths of people who have ingrained, their reality is what it is and you're not going to change it. But kind of like this whole thing about the 18%, you don't talk to them anyway. You talk to the innovators and the early adopters and you give them an opportunity to explore their natural curiosity and braveness to do it different. And then slowly what happens is it becomes safe for other people to do the same. And then the slow adopters at the far end of that long tail, they basically the quote I heard was they'll just do it because they have no other choice. It's like they stop using corded phones because you can't get a corded phone anymore. Like that's the only reason. It's just the rest of the world has moved on to a place where, they just do it because it's all that's left to them, you know?
Well, I don't think the model that I was relating to you had to do with anything nice. I think it had to do with Croatians killing Serbians. Well, why? Because they always have. The Hatfields and
Mhm,
the McCoys, they've forgotten why they're fighting. This is just what we do. So,
mhm.
what the question of who's shaking the jar does is it interrupts the moment. So you can
Oh,
actually say,
sure.
is there any rational, like now, in this moment, in the present, where I am right now, what does this actually call me to be going forward? And then that's the point where everybody lays their guns down and they walk away. and maybe they even have a party afterwards. And I think that's where we need to to get to, between races and women and sex and the and the and the. It's about somebody always shaking the damn jar, guys. Ain't nothing going on out there in reality. Only what people need to get you to believe so they can continue to get paid. That's what I'm talking about. The
Yeah. And
big
I guess, yeah, and I'll keep arguing that, you know, Marcus Aurelius, for example, lived as best he could as an exemplary human
Yep.
when the jar never stopped shaking. He lived an entire life of personal and leadership turmoil. It never got easier, it never got fair, and he chose to be the best human he could be in those circumstances, you know. And thing that I always find so amazing is even when you read Meditations, he didn't write it for anyone. He wrote it for himself to remind himself
Sure.
constantly of who he chose to be, you know. And he speaks over and over again about greedy people and angry people, and they're just being who they are, but that doesn't change the fact that I can be who I choose to be. So, you know, so maybe we're living in a time right now where we have to accept the fact that the jar is going to keep on shaking. Too bad. So now who are you going to be? You know, is it fair? No. Is it something in your control? No. That so these are the rules of the game right now. Who are you going to be? Sorry, I get a little passionate about this
Please
because
don't be
I
sorry.
feel
I will fight to the death so you can keep talking the way that you do. And I'm going to tell you what, I think what you're saying may be really powerful to a few people out there right now that are up to their eyeballs in it, and
yeah.
that you can, even though it seems like everybody's doing it, you be the one who's responsible for you and walk away for a minute. Go find out what's
Mhm.
really going on and what empowers and moves your life. As what Ken is talking about, we know about Marcus Aurelius because he lived. Okay. There were
Mhm.
probably 800,000 other, philosophers from that time period we know nothing about because they died. And so the neat part of it is it's also, these are all texts that have been available through the ages and taught in universities since the 1600s and whatever. So it's good stuff, and take it away and be the choice. Choose to
You
be
know,
the choice.
and it's funny, there's a good book called The Lives of the Stoics by Ryan Holiday. And
Yeah.
the majority of those Stoics, they were banished, they were exiled, they were forced
Yeah.
to commit suicide, they were tortured, they were stripped of everything except who they choose to be. You
Right.
know, it's like all I can think of is Patsy Cline's song, Is That All There Is to a Fire? You know, she wrote about when your house burns down, you lose everything, and then you realize you didn't. You know, there's loss and there's pain and there's sadness, but it's not you. You know, that's not who you are, you
Right.
know. And it's just, so there's so many examples of it, you know. But it's also difficult, you know. It's difficult to hold on to that when you're getting rattled around and everybody else is fighting.
And the best way to find out what you're made of is to be tested.
Yeah,
You want to find
absolutely.
out if a boat floats, you put it in water. You can't just walk around with your philosophies, being impressive to your friends. And then when the time comes to stand up and do the right thing, walk away. This is going to require that at least 18 of us decide, no, this is not going to stand. We're,
Yeah.
we're going another direction.
Yep.
Absolutely. Reality. And in an instant, I used to have a very dear friend who said, life is 100% conversation. So there's structural conversation, object to object. There's immediate conversation between, living beings like animals and people and what have you, where you have share thought glances and that sort of thing. And a communication and then there's representational. And 100% of what you and I live in was created out of language and linguistics. And as a result of that, we have a particular flavor of life that we've kind of like gotten in the habit of doing. So, in the meantime, if everything's a conversation, all you have to do is change the conversation. Don't like how things are going? start a new thread. Do something else. Pick up a book on the Stoics. Reality. Turns out that it's kind of a facetious term as far as what human beings can experience. No two people that have ever lived, are alive now, or ever will live, like a thumbprint, will ever experience the same reality.
Well, I was thinking about that when Ken and you were talking about people who live through similar circumstances and have totally different reactions to it.
Yes.
Mm, yeah.
So, I mean, I was thinking of my mother who came over during Nazi Germany. So, it was my mother. So, on my mother's side, I'm first generation, and I have relatives who died at concentration camps. My uncle and things like that, my great uncle, and so, but my grandparents' reaction to that whole situation and being in America and how they lived versus friends of mine who grew up in similar circumstances, whose families had very different reactions and responses. My mother chose never to go back to Germany again. After they left, she never went back. I've been 3 times. Yes, I wasn't personally there for that time of period, but I chose to go back. Um, and, I think that everybody's reaction is their own individual circumstances and how they were, sort of like almost genetically how they were predisposed and what they were in the effect of what they were surrounded by and what they were exposed to and the information and what got told or didn't get said. And then all of a sudden, um, being leaving space for everybody to have that own experience for themselves. That
Mm.
it's all individual in so many ways.
Yeah.
So Ken's experience of something in the same situation, I'm going to have a different experience, as are you.
Mhm.
Well, the kind of interesting, neat thing is that Ken, if you study it just a little bit, what you'll find is that most of the jar shaking has been going on for the last 400 years by a company whose last name is Rothschild. They have incited leaders to go to war and then paid both sides, for armaments and all
Mhm.
that sort of thing, and have made trillions of dollars. Their family has a estimated net worth currently of about $10 trillion. And the long and the short of it is that all the rest of us, the ones they'll never see, all of us living in the matrix, okay, we are the energy for them to continue to move pawns around. And the whole conversation about New World Order and all the rest of that, it gets talked about over and over and over, since the probably the 1600s. But the long and the short of it is that the rich people who align with that family go on forever, and the people who rail against it do not. And if you look at most of the globe where there's wartime going on, and you want to follow the money back to where it originally comes from, all it comes from the same place, because that's how you get richer.
So, so just an interesting thing. It doesn't live on with the individual. Every single one of them is dead, from 400 years ago, and
Nobody gets out alive.
it's, it's an interesting, yeah. And just what I find interesting is thinking about how many people that are in that jar that's being shook that live just beautiful lives. And yes, maybe it's not as fair as it could be. And yes, maybe they are being manipulated, but they're finding happiness. And I know a lot of rich people that are freaking miserable. And their whole lives they're miserable. Their whole lives they're fighting to hold on to that power or that wealth or whatever it is. And I wonder if they ever actually experience a day of fulfillment or happiness in their life. So, so again, I just keep coming back to yes, we want to, create a more balanced, world where there's true opportunity for fulfillment and abundance for everyone, but there's always going to be a level of unevenness in that playing field, I mean, and who are you Who do you choose to be
Hmm.
with this 80 to 100 years you get if you're lucky? Maybe you
Yeah.
get less, so, and it's just to me it's just such an interesting thing. So I worry about people who are so busy being angry at whatever, whether it's the people that have the money or the people that want to take away the money or the people that have the power, don't have the power. It's all
Or anything.
polarization, as opposed to, you know what? I can be happy on, there are people right now that retired in their 30s and they live on $25,000 a year and they are fulfilled. They are happy. There's someone I think on, maybe it's Instagram or something, that lives a life, and they talk about that and how, they just changed the way that they see the game, the rules of the game as it relates to them,
Yeah.
and they're good. They're good, you know? And a meteor could drop on their heads and kill them tomorrow. I mean, so in the end, it's like there's who are you while the jar's being shaken? I don't know. I just keep coming back to that.
Well,
And the jar may have outlived its usefulness. When it comes
Yeah,
back
yeah.
to reality, just know that very little of it is beyond your control. So if you want to choose something, choose joy, you know? The natural state for human beings is happiness. And what comes along is attachment. You start to get attached to things like how it ought to go, what you wanted to have happen. So just remember, it kind of doesn't matter in the end, as Ken is saying. Why not choose happiness for yourself? Take that line. Jan, I'm sorry.
no, no. I mean, I was thinking about what Ken was saying, like, who do you choose to be, whether you're like 80 to 100 or whatever. And since I think it's interesting when you have the picture. So now I have the picture of my dad's life since he just passed, and the people who have come out that have, it's spoken to my mom, like called my mom after 20 or 30 years not having spoken to them at all, saying what an impact that he had on their life, or what a kind person he was, or my father's smile was just like noteworthy. Like everybody talks about it. Everybody you meet, like, oh my gosh, he had the best smile. Like everybody. And that's the first thing. And she said to me, I didn't even realize that he smiled so much. Like I never, because she lived with it every day, maybe for
Yeah.
66 years. So didn't really impact her to like it wasn't obvious to her. But I think that that's when you get to see, like, all of a sudden I have this picture of what a quality, even though I thought it was, the best, what a quality human, what I would call a quality human being is, to have such an influence and impact on hundreds and hundreds of people, if not more.
I had the same thing with my dad. And here's a guy that, was a victim of medical malpractice. They did a simple spinal thing that led to a blood clot. They ignored it. He ended up with permanent nerve damage in his legs, changed, he ended up on disability. So money was always a struggle. And all everyone talked about was what an amazing just friend he was. He made everyone he saw laugh and feel seen, and he just sold furniture. He wasn't he wasn't some world leader. He wasn't some he just was a good man. He was a good man and a good human, and he had his flaws like everybody else, and he just did his
Mhm.
best. And that was it. Same thing. It's just, and that's what everybody says at the end. That's what's remembered. So, you know, global elites or whatever, yeah, sure, didn't change who he was and the impact he had as a human, just a good human being.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's remarkable when you see that in people who lived ordinary lives, you know, and had the normal hardships that people have. I mean, my parents always talk about the first year they were married. My father's father died like 3 weeks after they were married, have a heart attack at 50. My mother had a baby, and my father was diagnosed with an ocular tumor and lost his eye, all within like the first year and a half. And I think one of my great grandmothers passed away. So it was like, it was everything in life. And my brother was saying that at the funeral, he said that you would think that that would have made him, that could have made him a very bitter, sort of like fearful type person. The fact that he went blind in one eye, that he lost all these family members, and everything. And he was like, it never, never got him down. Like, I mean, he just kind of
Yeah.
went with he just went on from there. That was just what it was. And you just go on. Yeah. You do the best you can.
Yeah.
Well, the neat part of everything that we're talking about here is we're presencing that all of life is a narrative. And so you can choose to either be a monument to your failures, or you can choose to be a monument, to the great life you're going to have. And or a myriad other things. But the point is that you need to wake up about you and take charge in instances where you don't like how things are going, because they're not going any particular way at all. You're processing it in a way that's probably not making you feel all that great. Maybe. And what if there is a moment where you can shift things and you can be that person who's going to be, stand up for yourself. Who are you in the matter of your life? Who are you going to choose to be right now?
Well, and maybe it's helpful sometimes to, you know, consider the perspective of, how things play out beyond you. So, I mean, you're talking about my dad dying, and really honestly my stepdad. My biological father died when he was the age I am now. And he kind of abandoned us. He wouldn't have anything to do with us. So I grew up never really even knowing him. He remarried and had a son with his second wife, who only had his dad until he was 19, because my biological dad died young. And my hope is that his son from his second family had the father that he wasn't to me, because he made mistakes and wanted to do right when he got another chance. So that doesn't help me personally. I had a lot of stuff to deal with growing up. Just that was hard. But then I had models like my dad and his father, my grandfather, who took me in and treated me like their own. And I passed that on to my stepkids. So it's just interesting how, it was a pretty well shaken jar, and then it's like, who are you going to be? And I was fortunate in that I had one individual who modeled a way that I could be, that gave me a choice, because it dispelled ignorance I had about the person I could choose to be. So, and that's always stuck with me. It's like the things we do every day, you never know who's watching, or who that resonates with, where maybe that shifts them, just because you gave them a different view that they didn't know was possible, you know? So
Well, that's an interesting place for us to leave it. And I just want to ask one single question. Is there any you that you could never be?
is there any you that you could never be?
I was
Uh,
actually asking the audience.
oh, yeah, no, that's an interesting question to
If your
ponder.
answer if your
Yeah.
answer is I don't know, you're on good ground.
Yeah,
But
no, that was my thought.
if you're immediately coming up with a list of yous that could never be, you might want to take a look at that and see if you can open it up just a little bit.
Yeah.
With that said, we're going to be on hiatus here for a minute, but most of you won't notice that, because when the next episode of Lighting the Candle, A World Works comes out, it'll just be the next one in line. But in the meantime, I just want to thank both of you, and I want to thank you for the fire, and I want to thank you for the enthusiasm and the commitment, and just love who you are. I really do. And in the meantime, last thing, Eric Lopkin asked me to do this about 5 months ago, and I don't think you can ever do it enough. Would you please reach out to somebody in your life, either by text or phone or email, and let them know you care? Let them know that the world works better because they're there. And in the meantime, anything else, Ken, Jan?
No.
Now just go be you
Yep.
as best you can, just for today, as my mentor would say.
You know what? I came up with something over the weekend. I've got to throw it in here. It's like, teach your children they are good enough. And now the job is for them to decide what better means.
Yeah.
Bye-bye for now, y'all.
Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Lighting the Candle, A World That Works, part of the Exvadio Podcast Network. You can catch us each week, as well as the rest of the network, at exvadio.com/podcasts, as well as the Apple Podcasts app, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, Audible, Amazon Music, and wherever you find podcasts.